Hello, all. Thank you for joining. My name is Megan, and I have my colleague here, Aviva Vincent, and we'll be presenting on Reining and Anxiety, a manualized riding intervention using CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for children with anxiety. So my name's Megan, and I am a clinical instructor at NYU in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. I'm the co-developer and trainer for NYU's Reining and Anxiety program. And I have here with me Aviva Vincent. Can I introduce?
Hey y'all. So I am the program director at Fieldstone Farm Therapeutic Riding Center here in Ohio, and I'm also an assistant faculty in social work at Cleveland State University. And I joined the Reining and Anxiety team a couple years back and brought it here to Fieldstone, which is what we're going to share out with you today.
Awesome. So we have a lot of folks who have worked with us throughout the years on this protocol. And so we just want to acknowledge all the hard work that everybody's been doing. We've been led by our primary investigator, Kimberly Hoagwood, over at NYU. And then we have all of our partners listed out here. So thanks to them. So Reining and Anxiety is an adaptive riding program, and it is enhanced with cognitive behavioral therapy elements. So we're focusing on youth with anxiety, and we basically paired cognitive behavioral health elements with an adaptive riding program. So it's delivered by lay practitioners, it's community-based, it's delivered in a non-office space setting like the arena, and it's in a natural environment, and it's evidence informed, as in we looked at what the evidence base was showing, and we integrated those therapeutic elements that could be integrated into the arena setting. Next slide, please. Here's our website if you want to check it out. We have some general information, and then we also have some password protected sections for our instructors. So once you become trained in Reining and Anxiety, you can access those additional resources to know how to do each session. Next slide. Today, we'll talk a little bit about the development of Reining and Anxiety and like our intention and where we're going, and the concepts and strategies that we utilized, which focuses on symptomology of anxiety through a trauma-informed lens. And then we'll talk about some ways that you guys can engage or use Reining and Anxiety as a resource in your own programs. So we'll start with development. So this slide kind of just shows our background. So the research team consists of some people who are equestrians. A lot of us have a social work background, and so we do come at this with a systemic lens. And then we also have some expertise in school psychology. What we did is we looked at the literature that supports treatment for youth with anxiety. And we did that through consulting a database called PracticeWise. So PracticeWise reviews all of the evidence base for youth treatments, and we specified treatment. We're looking for treatment with anxiety, youth with anxiety, ages 2 to 19. And that yielded a result of all different protocols that people were using and demonstrated effectiveness for treatment of those symptomology. Through those protocols, PracticeWise also does this really cool thing where it will distill it into practice elements. So the practice elements that were recommended and shown by the evidence base to support treatment of youth with anxiety, there were 44 practice elements that were found throughout the literature. We decided to focus on the top 5 because they were in above like 40% of protocols. And so you can see here the percentages that we found. There is a lot of in vivo exposure that helps support decreased symptomology of anxiety symptoms, cognitive skills, client and caregiver psychoeducation, and then also relaxation skills. So we focused on integrating those into our protocol. Next slide. So what does it look like? So the basic structure is consistency and repetition and setting expectations. So sessions were originally designed to be done over multiple weeks as needed, but since this is research, and they already have groups a lot of times already prepared. And we're pushing into programs that already have therapeutic or adaptive riding programs in progress. We wanted to partner with specifically Fieldstone in this way to match what their needs were for participating in research. We also have journals, aka homework, but we call them journals, so that riders can work on things outside of session and practice their skills. One change that we also made when we partnered with Fieldstone was we originally had it scheduled as 8 sessions, but we bumped it to 10 sessions so that we could integrate more review if riders were absent. And then as the sessions progress, instructor choice and creativity increases. So once you have like the basic skills down, and again, we start with cognitive elements of, the basic is like emotion identification, those types of things, understanding that your thoughts, feelings, and your behaviors are connected, those types of things, and differentiating between a thought, a feeling, and a behavior. That's session 1, right? And so we integrate that, but then we have more repetition, and we also, it is variable depending to and flexible to what the rider's horsemanship skill is as well. And so that's all creative elements that the instructor can choose to infuse with what they are seeing in actual session. So the other structure is that some of it is mounted and some of it is unmounted. So each session begins with a review and connect. So like you're kind of talking about what the homework was, and then kind of priming and scaffolding what you're going to work on that day. Then there is a mount and warm up. And so like initially the mounts and warm ups are instructor led, and then over time, as the students or riders get used to it, then they can start to choose which warm up they want. Then there is the activity, which focuses on CBT, skill building, and talking about anxiety symptomology. And then there's a cool down and a dismount, which is usually a relaxation exercise. Again, harkening back to integrating all of those CBT elements that we found. And then there's a parent or caregiver psychoeducation and journal instruction at the end, and that's unmounted. And that's just kind of like a debrief. And the way that we do that is the instructor will ask the rider to explain to the parent what the session was about. And that's so that the instructor can understand client or rider retention of the information, and to share with the parent or caregiver what happened in each session so they can help the client or rider fill out their journal and complete the homework assignment. Next slide, please. So this is just our rough outline. I'm not going to, just for time's sake, I'm not going to walk through each session, but you can see here how we put it in sequence. So it's building on each other. We end up talking about cognitive distortions in a couple sessions later on. We talk about kind of a subjective unit of distress scale. And so we're helping riders to have the language to put to their anxiety symptomology, and then helping them attend by practicing specific skills that have been outlined by cognitive behavioral therapy to be effective. Next slide. So here's our timeline. So we kind of started talking about all of this stuff in 2016. And then we did partner with Gallup NYC in New York City for our first pilot study. And that pilot study differed a little bit. Again, it was the 8 sessions, and we had our instructors were trained, and then we had the same instructors doing multiple 10-session research protocol completions. And so they did that over, I think, 1.5 years. And we published on some of that stuff. And then that came out in 2021, but we also partnered with Fieldstone for the second pilot study, which was more about feasibility. And also one of the things we're very excited about is it included animal welfare and equine measures to assure that our intervention, and start talking about our intervention and the effects that it might have on our equine partners. And so that brings us up to now, where we are kind of just publishing a little bit and getting the word out about this protocol, and seeing if anybody else wants to partner with us in this way. 'Next slide, please. Okay, so Qualifying subjects. So just, I know I kind of mentioned that we looked at what was most efficacious for 2 to 19-year-olds. But again, we had to kind of narrow the scope a little bit to youth age 6 to 17, seeking services for anxiety or trauma symptoms and exhibiting anxiety. So these are our riders. This is what our instructors look like at Fieldstone. So they're currently employed at a riding center and routinely teaching these types of riding lessons. Our volunteers, and then of course our equines. And so this is how we established who was going to be able to work on our research protocol, and recognizing that we know that like clinical or how things are actually operationally done isn't always how research goes. And so kind of finding a nice balance where we could be supportive of our instructors and our administrative partners, and not being too influential and messing up what they have going already, but hopefully helping them decrease the burden and increase the feasibility in what they're asked to do in order to provide some research base for these types of things so that we can share it with everybody and share our results. Next slide.
And within all of this too, that there are a number of measures, right? So the idea, like the riders, for example, we had informed consent because it is research, then we had different measures that they had to complete in order to enter into the study, continue in the study, and then the way that we would look at data after the data collection or that study period was finished. So there's a number of measures that went into identifying and capturing data on all partners noted here.
Yeah. And we know it's hard to participate in research sometimes. So we get that. So we're trying to, I'm a practitioner as well, so I appreciate the administrative burden it is to partner in research, but hopefully working with Aviva, or I guess I would leave this up to Aviva to say, but hopefully it was a mutually helpful relationship. Aviva,
so one of the things that made this study unique, and one of the ways that I think research is really moving in this field that's so important, is looking beyond surveys. They're still really important and we need to do survey collection, but we also can now identify and collect saliva to look at physiological changes of an intervention. And so we have heard the call for this type of data inclusion since around 2011, right up through the time of the study. Now, the interesting thing is that the study that we're talking about today did happen during COVID. So we're talking about collecting saliva during the time of COVID-19. It is totally possible to do in a very health conscious and safe way. And so now that we're moving forward, we're able to still maintain those safety protocols and engage with this type of research in a really intentional and safe way. It's important to consider the collection of saliva because it is a minimally invasive and accurate way to collect data. So what I'm talking about when I say collect saliva, it means for people literally spitting into a little tube, or for the horses, as you saw in the prior slide, on the bottom right here, the horse has a bit in their mouth that is made from tubing, almost like a camelback backpack with a slit in it and a piece of cotton so that it collects pooled saliva from the horses. We're then able to take that, analyze it, and get things read like cortisol and oxytocin. So we can start to look at what is the stress that's happening, but also what is the affiliative bonding or happiness or whatever that attribute that we want to call it for both horses and humans happening during our intervention. So it's important to think about in terms of from a practice lens, why are we doing what we're doing and making sure that we have measures to capture the importance of that why. So again, this bit was the first step, right? So the first step when Reining and Anxiety came to Fieldstone and said, we want to use this manual again, test out the feasibility of this manual. But we also want to include the horses. How do we do that effectively? So we created this bit and then we used it comparing to a cheek swab. So this paper you can now read, the citation is on the bottom, but we compared it to a swab first because that is the typical way of collecting saliva for horses. And what we thought about was, the only time that these horses are having their cheek swabbed is when they're sick or they're needing medication or dewormer, things like that. Maybe that's actually stressful for them, whereas they may, and in our program, they actually use bitless bridles, but they may use a bit as part of their regular riding routine. And so how can we collect physiological data in the most natural way possible, knowing that collecting a spit from a horse is not the most natural thing. And what we did find is this bit was a more accurate way of capturing what's happening in the moment without inducing stress to the horse. And so again, you can read the paper all about that if you ever want to use it. It literally has instructions for how to make it too. So from this, we swabbed and used the bit on 8 different horses. We analyzed that data. There was no significant difference in oxytocin. The cortisol levels were higher in the swab. Now, this could be because the swab is a stress-inducing process, or that the location in the mouth of where we swab may be closer to the source of cortisol. And so what we're finding is that you get a more accurate reading from pooled saliva. So general from all over the mouth collected in one place is more indicative of what's actually happening in that moment. So further testing, of course, needed. But the modified bit is usable for measuring oxytocin and cortisol in horses, and we could potentially use this to triangulate the self-report measures and physiological data from youth. So that is where we move forward to the study as a whole. So before we did the research study, we did training.
So this is just kind of to that piece of like, if you're thinking about partnering with research, here's what our expectations were for a therapeutic or adaptive riding center to partner with us in this research. We have a 3-day in-person training where we review therapeutic stance and include safety planning as well. And so we also have we review the content, and they do role play, and there is a test out portion of the training. Then we do a little bit of, we pull from train the trainer techniques to do an instructor developed volunteer training, knowing that each agency or partner that we have has their own culture within the barn. And so wanting to make sure that we're culturally appropriate to what's already going on with your facility. And then we also include instructor prop supports too. So if you talk to any of our past instructors, we have a really cool fanny pack that comes along with the training. We also had online group supervision during the trial and optional study groups and individual supervision as needed. So basically I'm the clinical trainer, and I am available to people who have questions, and we do utilize that training as we're going through the protocol. So that would be the instructor expectation. And I just wanted to kind of like, again, discuss, like, we know that research isn't exactly operationally how clinical stuff happens or how the treatment actually happens, but for research to occur, we have to be a little bit strict sometimes. And so we try to do that in the most supportive way. So if you're interested in partnering, these are like the overarching expectations. Next slide. So when we partnered with Fieldstone, we were definitely trying to study fidelity more in depth. We did that with our NYU trial as well, or our NYC Gallup trial as well. And the fidelity is a binary yes/no. So it wasn't tracking child outcomes. It was tracking whether the instructor was able to do the protocol as the protocol was intended. And so you can see like a first outline here, like, did the instructor give the homework and talk through the homework, right? Like that would be one of the questions. And so just to see if our instructors, who again are lay practitioners providing mental health psychoeducation, are they able to do this? Next slide. So for data collection, we also not only do instructors do data collection for research purposes, but sometimes it's also important as a monitoring skill to let riders know how they're doing and remind riders of their progress. And so we see a benefit for data collection, not only for our research purposes, but also for enhancing client outcomes or rider outcomes. So just as instructors collect data, the riders were also collecting data and like clues. And so it's like a modeling technique in the form of self-monitoring, which is an important component of exposure and anxiety treatments. So they would prompt the riders like, hey, how are you feeling? Can you tell me how you're feeling? What's your level of anxiety right now? And it helps to model self-monitoring. And then starting to identify anxiety-provoking situations. So we really have the riders or the students kind of develop their own scenarios in which they can tell us what they're wanting to work on. So it's also a rider driven or client driven, with the assistance of the caregiver, of course, to work on what their therapeutic goals are. And then we would use the rider created fear thermometer. Again, that's the subjective units of distress whenever possible after session 2. And then add to that when we discover more about each scenario. So it's kind of like that would be the exposure portion of it. So I'm just trying to make the point of like the research data also can lend to supportive pieces for instructor delivery. Next slide. So what did we do for data collection? So the riders, we asked them child questionnaires, knowledge quiz. We gave them a knowledge quiz. So we wanted to know what they already knew before we started the protocol. We gave the caregiver questionnaires, and then we collected saliva from the riders. And then we also monitored heart rate. Our instructors also completed questionnaires, and during supervision, I take notes on questions, and we kind of have a form to fill out during those supervision sessions. I also tracked, the instructors also tracked attendance and the triad assignment, meaning like which horse was placed with which rider and what day, and what volunteers were placed with what rider as well. Volunteers gave us questionnaires as well, and volunteers were participatory in the saliva collection. So we're also looking at that element because we know that volunteers are an integral part of any therapeutic riding session. And then heart rate as well for volunteers. And then our equines, we, like Aviva mentioned, we collected saliva and heart rate. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. Yeah. So outcomes. Do you want to run through this slide, Aviva?
Yeah, sure. Love to.
Awesome.
So the collection of the saliva samples were from the horses, the riders, and the volunteers. We collected them in weeks 1, 4, 7, and 10, before and then after. We had, again, those other measures that were on an iPad. They filled them out before or and after their session, again, in weeks 1, 4, 7, and 10. The fidelity was all 8 weeks. And the other measures were just kind of our typical paperwork or, instructor notes, things like that we do as typical practice. In exciting news regarding our equine partners, there was no evidence of increased stress by the intervention, meaning that the level of increase that we saw in cortisol was not significant. We also saw for our riders that cortisol consistently decreased after each session. It was not significant, but it was a trend. We did have, again, a trend of oxytocin increasing at 2 of the 4 time points. Similarly, our volunteers were, they had were complicated biological beings, right? So we saw both an increase in stress, an increase in cortisol, and an increase in oxytocin. Not significant findings based on the data, but we saw that trend from the data overall. So we did a survey of the volunteers post-intervention with some open-ended questions. And what we heard back from them were things like, I feel a great sense of responsibility to keep my horse and rider safe, and I really love being here, and it brings me great joy. So this kind of both and tension that was coming up that was echoed in their physiological data. This is why that piece is just so important. We did notice that horse and rider consistency did not affect stress or bonding, meaning cortisol or oxytocin, as well as the students' responses on surveys throughout the intervention. So normally in practice, as a certified therapeutic riding instructor, I tend to think it's so important to keep the same horse with the same person. And while anecdotally it may be, it was not statistically. And so again, to Megan's point of like, there is this difference between what we do in research and what we see in practice, and actually shedding light on that is really interesting and important. Overall, the implications are that the intervention has some successful findings for children who are between 6 to 17 years of age and have anxiety. This helps in the shift towards making adaptive riding lessons an evidence-based practice. We're adding to that body of evidence by doing this research. And there's evidence of cognitive behavioral therapy with therapeutic riding or adaptive riding as an innovative and effective intervention. We had very high fidelity between what Megan did with our instructors in training and then what was actually done on the ground, which means that this intervention overall is accessible and effective to use as a teaching tool in the arena. So when we put this all into practice, what this means for you is if you're a clinician, you're a mental health clinician, and you're working in the community and somebody's not as responsive as you'd like them to be to treatment as usual in an office, there are other opportunities such as this. If you are somebody who already works with horses, right, there might be an opportunity to engage with parts of what we're already doing in practice. And if you're somebody who wants to dip their toe into research, there's an opportunity for partnership as well. So there's a lot of different branches that come off from one study for ways for the community to get involved. Is there anything more that you would like to add to that, Miss Megan?
I think that sounds amazing. And we just have some references there, and, you know, get in touch. We're happy to chat about whatever you got going, and open to questions and comments.
Yeah, so we will share this PowerPoint as well. It will be accessible to you. We encourage you, check out our website, give us a shout out if you want to talk a little bit more about ways to get involved. Again, if you're a community practitioner, or if you work with horses or want to volunteer with horses, ways that you can bring some of this intentionality into your volunteerism or work. And if you are somebody who wants to get involved in research and this is interesting to you, also please do reach out. We would love to chat more. We are looking at expanding and doing more of this research with this protocol throughout the community. So we're always looking to just connect and learn who else is interested in what questions you have. So thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to hearing from you.